Eliza Thompson stood in the middle of her new apartment, surveying the small, empty space. The studio was modest, a single room with a tiny kitchenette, a narrow bathroom, and tall windows that let in the pale, late afternoon light. Exposed brick walls and old wooden floorboards gave the place a certain charm that felt both vintage and timeless. It was nothing fancy, but after everything she had been through, it felt like a fresh start. A chance to leave the past behind, to rebuild herself away from the prying eyes of her old life. She let out a deep breath and set down the last of her moving boxes, wiping her hands on her jeans. It was quiet here, almost unnervingly so, but she welcomed it. After months of chaos, of sleepless nights and anxious thoughts, she craved the stillness. This apartment, with its antique fixtures and creaking floorboards, was supposed to be her sanctuary. It wasn't until her first night that she realized something was off. It started as a faint hum, barely noticeable beneath the distant sounds of the city. Eliza was lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. The hum was soft, almost soothing, like white noise. She thought it was just the pipes, the usual groans and murmurs of an old building settling into the night. But then, as she was about to drift off, she heard it. A whisper. It was so quiet she wasn't even sure she'd heard it at first. She strained her ears, waiting, but the apartment had gone silent again. She closed her eyes, chalking it up to her imagination. But the moment her mind began to relax, the whisper returned. A single, drawn-out word so distorted she couldn't make it out, like someone trying to speak through a wall. Eliza sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. She glanced around the room, but there was no one there. Of course there wasn't. She was alone. It was late, and she was tired, and she was probably just imagining things. That's what she told herself anyway. She lay back down, pulling the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the strange chill that had crept into the room. The whisper didn't come back that night, but when Eliza woke the next morning, she found herself staring at the spot on the wall where she thought she had heard it. It had been so real, so close, like someone was standing just inches away from her, their lips brushing against her ear. She shook her head, trying to laugh it off, but there was a nagging feeling she couldn't quite shake. She decided not to think about it. She had too much to do, and she wasn't going to let a bit of late-night paranoia ruin her first day in her new home. The next few days were a blur of unpacking, trips to the hardware store, and assembling flat-pack furniture. Eliza kept herself busy, trying to make the place feel more like home. She hung up pictures, bought new curtains, and even splurged on a set of fluffy white towels. She was determined to settle in, to make this apartment hers. And for a while it worked. The apartment felt warmer, cozier, like a place where she could finally breathe. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, just as she was drifting off to sleep, they would start. Sometimes they were faint, almost gentle, like a breeze rustling through the trees. Other times they were sharper, more insistent, as if someone was trying to get her attention. Eliza tried to ignore them, told herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But they always returned, growing a little louder each time. It wasn't just at night anymore. She started hearing them during the day, too, while she was brushing her teeth or washing dishes or standing in the shower. Faint, distorted murmurs that seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside the walls. It was always the same, low and unintelligible, like a language she couldn't quite understand. Eliza began to dread the quiet moments, the times when she was alone with nothing but her thoughts and the whispers. She tried to drown them out with music, but no matter how loud she played it, she could still hear them. faint and persistent, just beneath the surface. She even started sleeping with her headphones in, but it didn't help. The whispers slipped through the cracks, creeping into her dreams, twisting them into dark, tangled shapes. One morning, after a particularly restless night, she decided she needed to talk to someone about it. She'd only been in the building a few weeks and didn't know many of her neighbors, but there was one person who might be able to help. Mrs. Bloom, who lived just across the hall, had been in the building for over 30 years. She was a sweet, elderly woman who always greeted Eliza with a smile and had brought over a plate of cookies the day she moved in. If anyone knew the quirks of this old place, it would be her. Eliza knocked on Mrs. Bloom's door, feeling a bit foolish as she rehearsed what she was going to say. She wasn't even sure how to explain it without sounding crazy. "Hi, I think I'm being haunted by creepy whispers. Have you ever had that problem?" But before she could overthink it, the door swung open, and there was Mrs. Bloom, her warm, wrinkled face lighting up when she saw Eliza. "Well, hello, dear. What can I do for you?" she said, her voice bright and cheery. Eliza hesitated, then took a deep breath and decided to just come out with it. "I'm sorry if this sounds weird, but have you ever heard anything strange in your apartment? Like voices or whispers?" she asked, forcing a smile. For a moment, Mrs. Bloom's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough for Eliza to notice. Then it was back, as bright as ever. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that, dear," she said, patting Eliza's arm. "Old buildings like this one have a lot of history. They make all sorts of noises, creaks, groans, whispers. It's all perfectly normal." Eliza wanted to believe her, but there was something about the way Mrs. Bloom said it that made her uneasy. The words were reassuring, but her tone was off, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince Eliza. That night, as she lay in bed, Eliza thought about what Mrs. Bloom had said. "Old buildings make noises," she had told her. But these whispers didn't feel like the kind of noises an old building should make. They felt deliberate, purposeful, like someone was trying to get her attention. And as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard her name, soft and distorted, just beneath the hum of the city outside. "Eliza." She sat up, her heart pounding, but the room was empty, just as it had been every night before. Yet the whisper lingered, echoing in the back of her mind long after the apartment had gone silent again. Eliza was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. Her eyes were bloodshot, dark circles forming beneath them, and she had developed a nervous habit of chewing the inside of her cheek. Every night was the same. She would crawl into bed, exhausted, desperate for rest. But as soon as she closed her eyes, the whispers would start. Sometimes she thought she could almost make out words, but they were always just beyond her comprehension, twisting and distorting into nonsense. Tonight she had tried something different. She had turned on a fan, hoping the steady hum would drown out the sounds that haunted her. For a while it seemed to work. The rhythmic whirring soothed her, lulling her into a shallow, fragile sleep. But just as she was about to drift deeper, she heard it. A new sound. It started as a faint, rhythmic tap, like the gentle ticking of a metronome. Tap, tap, tap. Eliza's eyes snapped open, and she lay still, straining to hear. The sound was soft but steady, and it seemed to be coming from beneath her bed. She thought of the pipes again, of the old building settling, but this was different. This wasn't random or sporadic. It was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Her heartbeat quickened as she slowly pushed herself up on her elbows, peering over the edge of the bed. She half expected to see something staring back at her, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty space beneath the frame. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and the tapping stopped. For a moment, the room was silent, and she began to wonder if she had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. A harsh, scraping sound that sent chills skittering up her spine. It was like someone dragging a nail across wood, slow and deliberate, almost as if they wanted her to hear it. Eliza's skin prickled, her breath catching in her throat. She sat up fully now, every muscle in her body tense, her eyes darting around the room. The sound seemed to move, shifting from beneath her bed to the wall by the window, then to the corner of the room, always just out of sight. Eliza swallowed hard, telling herself it had to be a rat or some other small creature scurrying through the old building. But in the back of her mind, she knew that wasn't true. The sound was too precise, too purposeful, and it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. She tried to ignore it, rolling onto her side and squeezing her eyes shut. But the scratching continued, relentless and unyielding. It was as if something was clawing its way up from beneath the floorboards, trying to escape. She pulled the blankets over her head, hoping to block out the noise. But it only seemed to get louder, the scratching turning into a frantic, desperate scrape. Eliza couldn't take it anymore. She threw the blankets off and grabbed her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the cluttered floor of her room. But there was nothing unusual. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, forcing herself to get up, even though every instinct screamed at her to stay put. Her hand shook as she moved the flashlight across the room, following the sound, but there was nothing there. The scratching stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving her in a deafening silence. Eliza let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it was over, but just as she was about to put her phone down, she heard it again. This time, it wasn't just scratching. There was a faint, rhythmic breathing, slow and raspy, like someone struggling to take a breath. Eliza froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The breathing was coming from directly beneath her bed. She had never felt more awake, every nerve in her body on high alert, but she was paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. The sound was so close, as if there was someone lying just inches away, hidden beneath the wooden slats. She clenched her phone tighter, her knuckles turning white, and slowly leaned forward, inching her head over the edge of the mattress. She hesitated, every muscle in her body screaming at her to stop, but she forced herself to look. She peered into the darkness, squinting as her eyes adjusted, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a flicker of a shadow, a shape shifting just out of sight. She jerked back, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the bed, her eyes wide and wild. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see, but she couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear. She had to do something, anything, to prove to herself that it was all in her head. Grabbing the flashlight, she crouched down next to the bed and took a deep breath, steeling herself. She reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed the edge of the bed frame and slowly lifted it, just enough to see beneath. The beam of light swept across the dark, empty space, revealing nothing but dust and old floorboards. Eliza let out a sigh of relief, her shoulders slumping as the tension drained out of her. She felt silly for letting herself get so worked up, but as she started to pull back, she noticed something strange. There were marks on the floor, faint but visible, like tiny scratches carved into the wood. She moved the flashlight closer, her brow furrowing as she traced the patterns with her eyes. The scratches were small, barely noticeable, but they crisscrossed the floor in chaotic, erratic lines, as if someone, or something, had been scratching at the wood for a long time. Eliza's breath hitched and she reached out to touch one of the marks, but the moment her fingers brushed against it, the scratching started again, louder and more frantic than before. She jumped back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam of light spinning wildly, casting shadows that danced along the walls. She wanted to scream, to run out of the apartment and never look back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the spot beneath the bed where the sound was coming from. And then, for the first time, she thought she heard something beneath the scratching, a voice buried deep in the noise, faint but unmistakable. Eliza. She felt her stomach drop, her entire body going cold. She had heard her name before in the whispers that haunted her at night, but this was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a plea, a desperate, mournful sound that sent a chill down her spine. Eliza stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall as she struggled to catch her breath. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't want to understand, but she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond the creaking pipes and settling floorboards of an old building. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Mrs. Bloom's number. The line rang and rang, each passing second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the call connected, and Mrs. Bloom's voice crackled through the speaker. "Hello? Eliza, is that you?" Eliza's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Mrs. Bloom, I heard it again. The scratching, the whispers. It said my name." There was a long pause on the other end, and Eliza could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in the background. Then Mrs. Bloom spoke, her voice soft but strained, like she was trying to keep something hidden. "Old buildings make noises, dear," she said, the words slow and deliberate. "Sometimes they speak. Sometimes they remember." Eliza's blood ran cold. "What do you mean they remember?" Mrs. Bloom hesitated, and for a moment Eliza thought the line had gone dead. But then she spoke again, her voice barely audible, like a whisper slipping through the cracks. "Be careful, Eliza," she said. "Sometimes they're not just noises." The line went dead, and Eliza was left standing in the dark, the phone slipping from her hand. She could still hear the scratching, louder and more desperate than ever, echoing through the floorboards beneath her feet. And somewhere, beneath it all, a voice called her name. Eliza spent the next few days in a haze, her thoughts heavy and muddled from the lack of sleep. The whispers and scratching had been relentless, wearing her down, fraying the edges of her sanity. She couldn't focus, couldn't think straight, and she was beginning to feel like a prisoner in her own home. Every time she tried to leave the apartment, she found herself hesitating at the door, as if some invisible force was pulling her back inside. She hadn't heard from Mrs. Bloom since their last conversation, and the old woman hadn't been answering her phone. The scratching was worse now, louder and more urgent, as if whatever was making the noise was getting closer. Eliza tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was there every night, clawing at her nerves, dragging her deeper into a state of perpetual dread. She began to catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows flitting across the walls, shapes that disappeared the moment she tried to focus on them. She was starting to wonder if she was losing her mind. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth in the bathroom, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked terrible. Her skin was pale, her eyes red and sunken, her hair limp and unkempt. She barely recognized herself. She leaned closer, studying her reflection, and for a moment she thought she saw it smile. It was just a flicker, a brief curl of the lips that vanished as soon as she blinked, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She stepped back, her toothbrush clattering into the sink, and turned away from the mirror, her chest tight with fear. Eliza forced herself to calm down. She was imagining things. She had to be. But even as she tried to convince herself, she could still feel the weight of something unseen, watching her, waiting. She turned on every light in the apartment, hoping to chase away the shadows, but it did little to ease her growing sense of unease. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, whispering her name over and over again, like a chant. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, she made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this. She needed to find out what was happening, even if the answer scared her. She grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand and sat up, her hands trembling. The scratching had started again, louder than ever, coming from the same spot beneath the floorboards. Eliza's breath hitched, but she forced herself to move, to confront whatever was making the noise. She pried up one of the floorboards near the bed, her hands slick with sweat, and shined the flashlight into the dark space beneath. The beam of light cut through the shadows, revealing a narrow gap filled with dust and cobwebs. For a moment she saw nothing, just the empty void beneath the floor. But as she adjusted the angle of the flashlight, she caught a glimpse of something pale and out of place. Eliza's pulse quickened. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough wood. Slowly, she pulled the flashlight closer, peering into the dark crevice. There, half buried in the dust, was what looked like a piece of fabric, stained and torn. She hesitated, her mind racing with thoughts of what it could be, but she forced herself to reach down, to pull at the edge of the cloth. It came loose easily, and as she lifted it, a shower of dust fell from the fabric, revealing a patch of dark, mottled skin beneath. Eliza's stomach churned, but she couldn't look away. She tugged harder, and the fabric tore, peeling away from whatever it was attached to. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the floor, but in that brief, stuttering light she saw it clearly. A hand shriveled and contorted, the fingers curled into a rigid, unnatural claw. Eliza screamed, stumbling backward, her foot catching on the torn-up floorboards. She fell, her back slamming against the bed frame, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing beneath the floor. The hand was skeletal, the skin stretched tight over the bones, the nails black and cracked. It was like something out of a nightmare, a grotesque parody of a human limb, and it was just lying there, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. Her mind was screaming at her to get out, to run as far away from this place as possible, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear and revulsion. The scratching had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was thick, oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. And then she heard it, a low, raspy breath, like the sound of someone exhaling through clenched teeth. Eliza's mouth went dry. She slowly raised the flashlight, her hands shaking, and shined it back into the gap beneath the floor. For a moment, there was nothing, just the pale hand lying in the dark. But then she saw it. The hand was moving, the fingers twitching, scraping against the wood. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. She could only watch as the hand began to drag itself forward, inch by inch, pulling something else out of the shadows. A face emerged, barely visible in the dim light. It was twisted and gaunt, the skin gray and mottled, the eyes sunken and black. The mouth was stretched wide, frozen in a grotesque grin that seemed to mock her fear. Eliza felt bile rise in her throat as the thing's head slowly turned, its empty eyes locking onto hers. She scrambled to her feet, her entire body trembling, but before she could run, the whispers surged, louder and more frantic than ever. They filled her head, drowning out her thoughts, and she could feel them wrapping around her, pulling her back toward the dark space beneath the floor. "Eliza, let me out," the voice whispered, clear and distinct, cutting through the cacophony in her mind. She didn't know what to do. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to the flashlight, and every instinct was screaming at her to get out of there, but she couldn't look away. The thing was still moving, crawling out from the dark, its hands clawing at the floor, dragging its broken, twisted body into the light. As it emerged, Eliza saw that it wasn't just a body. It was a patchwork of limbs, stitched together in a grotesque mockery of a human form. The skin was stretched and torn, revealing patches of muscle and bone beneath, and the head lolled to the side as if it was barely attached. The thing's mouth was moving, but the words seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside her own mind. "Help me," it said, the voice distorted, almost childlike. "Please." Eliza's mind was reeling, her vision blurring with tears. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the thing was still crawling, its body contorting in ways that no human body should, dragging itself closer, inch by inch. She backed up until she hit the wall, her hands scrabbling for something, anything to defend herself. But there was nothing. The thing reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against her ankle, and Eliza felt a jolt of icy cold shoot up her leg. She kicked at it, but it didn't let go. It was stronger than it looked, its grip tightening, pulling her down. She could feel its breath on her skin, cold and damp, and when she looked down, she saw its mouth opening, wider and wider, revealing a dark, gaping void. She screamed, thrashing wildly, but the thing's grip was unyielding. Its mouth was inches from her leg now, and she could feel the whispers pouring out, wrapping around her, suffocating her. "Let me out," it whispered, the words slithering into her mind, filling her head with a dull, aching pressure. "You have to let me out." In a desperate frenzy, Eliza grabbed the nearest object, the flashlight, and swung it down with all her strength. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, and the thing recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for her to pull free. She scrambled to her feet, her vision swimming, and stumbled toward the door. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She tore out of the apartment, her feet pounding down the hallway, her breath ragged and shallow. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her like a slap to the face. She collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, her mind still echoing with the whispers. The image of that thing burned into her memory. She didn't know what she had seen, didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. Something was trapped in that apartment, something that shouldn't have been there. And whatever it was, it wanted out. But as she sat there, shaking and terrified, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with her yet. The whispers had followed her, echoing faintly in the back of her mind, and she knew deep down that no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. Eliza hadn't slept in days. Her body was running on fumes, her mind a tangle of fear and confusion. She had tried to stay away from the apartment, spending nights in cheap motels, in coffee shops that stayed open until dawn, but it didn't matter. The whispers followed her wherever she went, slipping into her thoughts, seeping through the cracks in her mind. She could hear them even now, faint and persistent, like a song she couldn't forget. She didn't understand how it was possible, but deep down, she knew. The thing in her apartment had found a way inside her head. It had been whispering to her, calling to her, long before she ever heard the scratching beneath the floorboards. And now it was getting louder, more insistent, as if it was running out of time. She stood outside the building, staring up at the dark windows of her apartment. It looked so ordinary from the outside, just another old, forgotten structure in a city full of them. But Eliza knew better now. She knew there was something hiding in there, something that had been waiting for her, watching her, and it was tired of being ignored. She didn't want to go back inside. Every rational part of her screamed to turn around, to get on the first bus out of the city and never look back. But she couldn't. The whispers wouldn't let her. They had dug their way into her thoughts, twisting and warping them until she wasn't sure where they ended and she began. She had to know the truth, even if it destroyed her. With a shaky breath, she pushed open the front door and stepped into the darkened lobby. The familiar scent of dust and mildew hit her, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. The building was silent, unnaturally so, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for her. She hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, but the whispers urged her on, their voices blending into a single droning chant. Eliza, Eliza. She forced herself up the stairs, her legs heavy and unsteady, her heart pounding with every step. The hallway on her floor was dark, the overhead light flickering weakly, casting shadows that seemed to shift and writhe on the walls. Eliza's hands were trembling as she fumbled with her keys, the metal slipping between her fingers. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to see whatever was waiting for her, but she had no choice. The whispers were pulling her forward, dragging her closer and closer to the truth she had been running from. The door creaked open, and Eliza stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The apartment was exactly as she had left it, but it felt different now, like the air was thicker, heavier. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her, suffocating her. The flashlight she had left on the floor was still there, its metal casing dented from where she had swung it at the thing's hand. She picked it up, her fingers curling around the cold, familiar weight, and flicked it on. The light sliced through the darkness, revealing the splintered floorboards, the gap she had pried open in a moment of frantic desperation. She took a step closer, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The whispers were louder now, more coherent, and she could hear them forming words, twisting into sentences that echoed in the back of her mind. "You let me out. You have to finish it." Eliza didn't know what it meant, but she could feel the truth pressing against the edges of her consciousness, threatening to spill out. She dropped to her knees, shining the flashlight into the gap beneath the floor, but this time she didn't see a hand. There was nothing there but shadows, deep and endless, stretching back into the dark. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall. The whispers were in her ears, in her head, crawling under her skin, and she could feel them tugging at her, pulling her deeper, urging her to look closer. She didn't want to, but her body moved on its own, her hands prying at the boards, ripping them away until the gap was wide enough for her to slip through. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and slid her arm into the dark space, her fingers searching for something, anything that would make sense of all this. The wood scraped against her skin, the splinters digging into her flesh. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, and she froze. For a moment, she thought it was another piece of fabric, but as she pulled it closer, she realized it was bone. A rib, yellowed and brittle, attached to a skeletal torso that seemed to extend deep into the shadows beneath the floor. She recoiled, her stomach churning, but she couldn't let go. She could feel the whispers pressing against her, urging her on, and she understood, finally, that this was what they wanted. They wanted her to see it, to know it, to understand. With trembling hands, she pulled at the bones, dragging them out of the darkness, and as she did, the rest of the body began to emerge. It was a mangled, twisted thing, half-rotted and barely holding together, like a marionette that had been left to decay. But there was something wrong about it, something that made Eliza's skin crawl. The body wasn't just a corpse. It was still moving, its head lolling to the side, its eyes black and empty, but alive. Eliza scrambled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She wanted to run, to flee, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The thing's mouth was moving, the skin cracking and peeling as it spoke, and the words that came out were her own. "You have to let me out," it said, its voice echoing in the same broken, distorted tone she had heard every night. "You have to finish what you started." Tears blurred her vision, but she could still see the thing's face, its hollow black eyes boring into hers. It was like looking into a mirror, a twisted, nightmarish reflection of herself. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and she felt the room tilt, the floor shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a memory. The whispers surged, a tidal wave of voices crashing over her, and she could see it now, the fragments of a past she had buried so deep she had forgotten it. The old apartment, the dark room, the way the walls seemed to close in around her. She remembered hiding, cowering beneath the floorboards as the shadows loomed over her, whispering her name, telling her to be quiet, to be still. She remembered the cold hands that had pulled her out, the way they had gripped her, dragging her back into the dark. She had tried to fight, but it was no use. The shadows had swallowed her whole, and she had been trapped there, waiting, listening, until someone found her, until someone set her free. "Eliza," the thing whispered, its voice trembling with a sad, desperate longing. "You forgot about me. You left me here." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't understand, I don't—" But she did. She could see it now, the dark corners of her mind unfurling, revealing the truth she had hidden from herself. She hadn't just moved into this apartment. She had come back to where it had all started, back to where she had tried to escape all those years ago. The whispers weren't just voices. They were memories, fragments of a past she had tried to forget, but they had never left. They had been waiting, festering, growing louder, until she had no choice but to listen. The thing beneath the floorboards reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against hers, and she felt a jolt of recognition, a cold, sharp pain that pierced through her chest. She wasn't looking at a ghost. She was looking at herself. A piece of herself that had been left behind, trapped in the dark, waiting for someone to let it out. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the thing heard her. Its mouth twisted into a sad, broken smile, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been forgotten. "You have to remember," it said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. "You have to let me go." Eliza didn't know how, didn't know if she could, but she understood what it was asking. She had to face it, had to confront the shadows she had been running from, the dark parts of herself she had tried to bury. She took a deep breath, her hands steady for the first time in days, and reached out, her fingers brushing against the thing's cold, bony hand. As soon as she touched it, the room seemed to shift, the walls warping and bending, the shadows receding into the corners. The whispers faded, their voices growing softer, until there was nothing but silence. Eliza felt a strange sense of calm, like she was finally waking up from a long, terrible dream. The thing beneath the floor smiled one last time, its eyes bright and sad, and then it was gone, dissolving into the dark, leaving only the faintest echo of its voice behind. "Thank you," it whispered, and then there was nothing. Eliza sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the thing had been, her mind quiet and still. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if the whispers would come back, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to the window, the first light of dawn breaking over the city. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, the kind of blue that made her think of beginnings, of new days. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her, and in that moment, she knew she had to leave. She didn't belong here, not anymore. The past had let her go, and it was time for her to do the same. Eliza turned away from the window, leaving the apartment behind, and as she stepped out into the hallway, she thought she heard the faintest whisper, soft and distant, like a sigh. But when she looked back, there was only silence. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, and smelled faintly of mildew. The handwriting on it was jagged, as if the pen had been gripped too tightly. It simply read, "Peter Willis." There was no return address. Peter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope with unease gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. For weeks now, he'd been researching cold cases, digging into Illinois' most infamous murders for an article that might finally launch his career. But the name John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, kept pulling him in deeper. Every time he thought he had enough material, some new thread would appear, dragging him further into the abyss. And now this envelope, delivered by hand, not mail, was sitting on his kitchen table like a gift no one wanted to open. He took a breath, slid a knife under the seal, and pulled out a single piece of paper. A photograph fluttered out and landed face up on the table. It showed a man in clown makeup, grinning ear to ear, but the smile was cracked, uneven, as if the skin was splitting beneath the paint. Peter recognized the face immediately. John Wayne Gacy. But this wasn't one of the usual mugshots or crime scene photos. This was different. Gacy's eyes stared directly into the lens, too alive, too aware. His grin looked more like a warning. Peter shoved the photograph aside and unfolded the letter. The words, scrawled in jittery ink, felt like a riddle. They told you he died. They lied. He's waiting, Peter, and I know where to find him. The signature at the bottom was a name Peter barely remembered. Darren Gacy. A chill ran through Peter's spine. Darren was a distant cousin, someone he had met once at a family gathering over a decade ago. They hadn't stayed in touch, and Peter had almost forgotten his existence, until now. Why would Darren, of all people, be writing to him about one of the most infamous serial killers in history? Below the message, Darren had scribbled an address, 307 Southfield Road, Crawford County. Peter leaned back in his chair, the letter still clutched in his hand. He had heard of Crawford County, a forgotten patch of land riddled with abandoned houses and the ghosts of bad memories. Gacy's body had been buried 6 feet deep, cremated, and scattered into oblivion. Everyone knew that. And yet, as Peter sat there, the letter burning in his hands, an unease began to settle over him, like the first gust of wind before a storm. 2 days later, Peter was on the road, the landscape shifting from urban decay to rural emptiness. The farther he drove, the more the towns seemed to rot away, each one smaller, more desolate, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Rusted trailers sat half-buried in mud, their windows shattered and curtains fluttering like old skin. Signs on long-abandoned gas stations creaked in the wind, promising cold beer and cheap cigarettes to no one. Peter gripped the wheel tighter as a strange anxiety gnawed at him. Darren's words echoed in his mind. "He's waiting, Peter, and I know where to find him." By the time Peter reached 307 Southfield Road, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the crumbling driveway. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its windows boarded up, and the paint peeling away in long, jagged strips. A single light flickered in the upstairs window. Peter killed the engine and sat there, staring at the house. For a moment, he considered leaving, just turning the car around and heading back to Chicago, away from whatever madness Darren had dragged him into. But then, he saw something, or thought he did. A figure moved behind one of the windows, just a shadow, really, but it was enough to set Peter's heart racing. He wasn't alone. The door creaked open under Peter's hand, revealing a dim hallway that smelled of mold and rotting wood. The wallpaper was peeling, curling like dead skin, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Peter hesitated in the doorway, listening to the silence. Somewhere in the house, water dripped steadily, tap, 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 like the ticking of an invisible clock. "Darren," Peter called out, but his voice felt small in the emptiness. No answer. He moved deeper into the house, each step drawing him further from the safety of the open door. The walls were lined with framed photographs of clowns. But these weren't happy or friendly faces. They were twisted, distorted, with makeup smeared into grotesque smiles. Some of the faces looked human, but others seemed to shift under Peter's gaze, as if their features were trying to rearrange themselves into something more monstrous. He found Darren sitting in the living room, hunched over a tattered notebook. The man looked terrible, his hair greasy and unkempt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. A cigarette burned between his fingers, untouched, its ash trailing down like a gray scar. "You came," Darren whispered without looking up. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I didn't think you would." Peter stood awkwardly in the doorway. "What is this, Darren? What the hell is going on?" Darren finally looked up, and Peter felt a shiver crawl down his spine. There was something off about Darren's eyes, something wild and desperate, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. "He's not gone, Peter," Darren whispered, his voice trembling. "They buried him, but they didn't stop him. He's still here. I've seen him." Peter stared at him. "Gacy? What are you talking about? He's been dead for years." Darren let out a hollow laugh. That's what they want you to believe. But I know the truth. I've seen him, Peter. In my dreams. In the walls. He's waiting. And he's hungry. Before Peter could respond, Darren stood up abruptly and grabbed his arm. His grip was cold, his nails digging into Peter's skin. "You have to be careful," Darren hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "Once you start digging, you can't stop. He won't let you." Peter pulled away, unsettled by the manic fear in Darren's voice. "This is insane," he muttered. Darren shook his head. "It's not, you'll see. He's already watching you." Peter's mouth went dry. "Watching me?" Darren smiled, a twitching, nervous grin that stretched his lips too wide. "You'll feel it soon enough. The itch under your skin, the laughter in your head. That's how it starts." Peter tried to sleep that night on Darren's couch, but the house wouldn't let him. The walls creaked and shifted, and every time he closed his eyes, he heard distant laughter, soft at first, but growing louder as if coming from just behind the walls. At some point, he drifted off, only to wake with a jolt, gasping for air. His hands were covered in dirt, and the taste of soil lingered on his tongue. His heart raced as a horrible thought clawed its way into his mind. Something was watching me while I slept. And Darren was gone. Peter sat on his couch, staring at the worn VHS tape resting in his hands. The words, "Pogo's Secrets," were scrawled across the white label in jagged handwriting. He found it sitting on his doorstep this morning, wrapped in newspaper and twine. There was no note, no sender, just the tape, waiting for him like an unwanted memory clawing its way out of the past. He knew he should throw it away, burn it, forget it ever existed. But he didn't. Instead, Peter slid the tape into his old VCR, heart hammering in his chest. The screen flickered to life with static, the hum of the machine loud in the quiet apartment. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the screen rippled and an image began to take shape. A clown stared back at him. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy sat in front of the camera, grinning from ear to ear in his clown persona. Pogo. His white makeup cracked at the edges, the red paint around his mouth smeared into jagged lines that stretched unnaturally wide, as if someone had taken a knife to his face and carved the grin deeper. His eyes glimmered with something vile, something alive and far older than the man wearing the makeup. "Hello, boys and girls," Gacy said cheerfully, his voice carrying an eerie sing-song quality. He adjusted the oversized clown bow tie at his neck, tilting his head to the side. "Pogo's here to tell you a little secret, a magic secret. Wanna know how I keep smiling? The screen flickered, and for an instant, the frame glitched, warped. Gacy's grin stretched wider, his painted lips curling back until Peter swore he saw teeth beneath the paint. Teeth that weren't human, yellowed, jagged like the fangs of some hungry animal. Gacy leaned closer to the camera, as if sharing a private joke. "You see, the trick to a smile is knowing how to sew it on tight. If you don't..." He jerked his head sharply, and a wet ripping sound filled the speakers. "Well, let's just say things can get messy." Suddenly, the screen cut to black. Peter exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. His hands were shaking, but he couldn't look away. The black screen flickered, and then, without warning, the scene changed. Now the camera was pointed at a poor child's birthday party. A group of children sat in a semicircle on the floor, their faces obscured by strange shadows. Gacy, still in his pogo persona, stood in the center, waving a colorful balloon. But something was wrong. The children weren't smiling. Their mouths were open as if they were screaming, but there was no sound. The tape jumped again, the footage crackling with static. When the image returned, the children were gone. Gacy stood alone in the frame, grinning that terrible grin. His hands, stained with something dark, were tucked behind his back. "Where did they go, you ask?" Gacy whispered, his voice low and conspiratorial. He leaned even closer to the camera, his painted face filling the screen. "They're right here, right under your skin." The screen dissolved into static, and then the tape ended, abruptly, without credits or explanation. Just silence. Peter sat motionless on the couch, his pulse racing. He felt like he'd just stared into a nightmare that was far from over. Peter turned off the TV, but the silence that followed was oppressive. His apartment felt wrong, as if the walls were leaning closer, listening. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just a tape, just some disturbing artifact from the past. But then he heard it. Laughter. Soft, distant, and high-pitched. It echoed through his apartment, bouncing off the walls. Peter's skin prickled as goosebumps rose along his arms. He checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were shut tight. There was no one else here. And yet, the laughter persisted. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the apartment. Peter stumbled into the bathroom, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He splashed cold water on his face and stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection gazed back, pale and exhausted. But something wasn't right. His face, his mouth looked strange. He leaned closer to the mirror, his breath fogging the glass. For a moment he thought it was just the stress, but then he saw it. His lips were starting to curl into a smile, a grin that wasn't his own. Peter gasped and rubbed at his face, trying to wipe away the expression. But the more he rubbed, the tighter the smile seemed to cling, like it had been sewn there, just as Gacy had warned. His reflection in the mirror blinked at him. But Peter didn't blink back. That's when he knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Peter unplugged the VCR and threw the tape into a drawer, but it was too late. The laughter followed him throughout the night, soft, childlike giggles that echoed through the walls, growing louder whenever he tried to sleep. He tossed and turned on his bed, suffocating beneath his blanket, until the room felt like a coffin. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, the nightmares came. He was trapped in a dark room. The walls lined with mirrors. In each reflection, he saw himself, but not quite. His mirrored selves wore Pogo's painted grin, their eyes glassy and lifeless, their mouths stretched too wide. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the endless laughter. Gacy's laughter. Loud and shrill, ringing through the mirrors like a child's broken music box. Peter awoke, gasping for air, his bedsheets tangled around him like a straitjacket. His body ached, as if he'd been twisting and writhing in his sleep. And that's when he noticed the bite marks. They were small but deep, dotting the length of his arms like a twisted constellation. The skin was bruised purple and red, with tiny indentations that looked unmistakably like teeth marks. But they weren't human, not exactly. The teeth had been too sharp, too jagged. Peter's stomach churned as he inspected the marks. His hands were caked with dirt again, black soil, as if he'd been digging all night. But there were no tools in his apartment, no dirt anywhere. Just his hands, sore and cracked, his nails split and raw. And then there was the mask. It lay on the floor beside his bed. A clown mask, identical to the one Gacy wore in the video. The rubber was slick with blood, and the edges curled inward like a hungry mouth waiting to be fed. Peter stared at the mask in disbelief, bile rising in his throat. He didn't remember finding it. He didn't remember anything. The next morning, Peter sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the drawer where he had stashed the tape. He could feel it in there, humming like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a recording. It was something more, something alive. He knew deep down that watching the tape had been a mistake. Gacy's evil wasn't just contained within the footage. It was spreading, seeping into his mind, his body, his very skin. Peter rubbed at his arms, trying to shake the feeling that something was crawling beneath the surface. The bite marks throbbed and the corners of his mouth twitched, threatening to curl into another smile. And in the quiet of the morning, beneath the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the clock, Peter heard it again. A soft giggle. Somewhere deep inside him, Pogo was waking up. The dirt beneath Peter's nails wouldn't come off. No matter how much he scrubbed, it clung to his skin, filling the cracks of his fingers and burrowing under his nails. The dark grime reminded him of the mass graves he'd read about, the ones hidden beneath Gacy's house, where bodies had been stacked like firewood, forgotten beneath the earth. He tried to tell himself that the dirt was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, but he knew it was real, and the voice in his head, Pogo's voice, whispered the same thing every night. You know where they are. They've been waiting for you. Peter stared at the map on his apartment wall, his hands trembling. Red circles marked each location connected to Gacy's murders. But the deeper Peter searched, the more patterns began to emerge. Patterns no one else had ever noticed. Some graves had been found, others remained hidden, but all of them aligned along an unsettling network of ley lines, cutting through the town like veins, pulsing with something ancient and malignant. At the center of it all was the ruins of Gacy's house, long since demolished, but Peter knew the truth. The house may be gone, but what lay beneath it was still alive. He felt it calling to him, tugging at the edges of his mind, like hands pulling him down into the earth. And with each passing day, the urge to dig grew stronger. It started with Site 21, an overgrown lot on the outskirts of town, where Gacy's first victims had been discovered years ago. Peter arrived just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a shovel, and a notebook filled with notes that made less and less sense the longer he stared at them. The land was wild and unkempt, the weeds waist-high and the ground soft beneath his boots. He knew he wasn't supposed to be here. The site had been officially closed after the remains were exhumed, but something told him the job had never really been finished, that there were more bodies beneath the earth than anyone knew. Peter's flashlight beam cut through the encroaching darkness, sweeping over the uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and rot. As he knelt down and pressed his hand to the dirt, a chill ran through him, and for a moment he swore he could hear muffled voices, like whispers buried beneath the ground. "Help us," Peter gasped, jerking his hand away, but the voices continued, soft and pleading, growing louder the longer he stayed. "We're still here. Dig us up. Dig us up." The words twisted inside his brain, filling every crevice with their desperate cries. His hands shook, but he couldn't resist. Before he knew what he was doing, Peter was digging, his fingers clawing into the soft earth, pulling up chunks of mud and stone. The shovel felt useless in his hands, too slow, too clumsy. He needed to feel the dirt beneath his nails, to touch what lay beneath the surface. The whispers grew louder, almost joyful now, and then, just as his fingers scraped against something hard, he felt it. A hand. It was cold and leathery, the skin stretched tight over bone. Peter stared in horror as he unearthed more of the corpse, revealing a grinning skull. Its jaw twisted into a rictus smile. The lips, what remained of them, had been sewn shut with thick black thread. Peter stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could fully comprehend what he was seeing, the hand twitched. The corpse moved ever so slightly, its skeletal fingers curling toward him. The grin on the skull seemed to widen, and in that moment, Peter knew. These weren't just dead bodies. They were something worse. They were waiting to come back. Peter staggered away from the grave, his mind spinning. He wiped his filthy hands on his pants, but the dirt seemed to cling tighter, as if it was embedding itself into his skin. His heart raced, and he could still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, tugging at his sanity. "We're still here." Back in his apartment, Peter paced the room, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the grinning skull, the stitches pulling its lips into an eternal smile. Worse, he could still feel the hand's cold grip on his own, as if the touch had burned into his bones. He tried washing the dirt from his hands again, scrubbing until his skin was raw. But no matter how hard he tried, the grime remained. It had wormed its way beneath his skin, becoming a part of him. He could feel it crawling beneath his flesh, tiny movements like worms wriggling just beneath the surface. Peter collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. His arms ached and his fingers twitched involuntarily. He peeled back his sleeves and stared in horror at what he saw. Small, circular bruises had appeared along his arms, forming a jagged pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. A smile. It was as if the bruises were shaping themselves into Pogo's grin, spreading inch by inch across his skin. And then the worst realization hit him. He hadn't been alone at the grave. Something had followed him home. Peter became obsessed. He knew he couldn't stop, not now. The bodies, the tunnels, the whispers, they were all connected. Something ancient lay beneath the town. Something hungry that had fed on Gacy's victims and now wanted more. And it wasn't just haunting him, it was becoming him. He spent hours researching old blueprints and maps of the area, tracing the tunnels that ran beneath Gacy's former house. They connected to other graves, other burial sites, each one like a waypoint in a network of death. And every line, every tunnel, led back to the ruins of Gacy's basement. That was where it all began, and that was where it had to end. But as Peter stared at the maps spread across his kitchen table, he felt something move beneath the skin of his arms again, this time more deliberate. The sensation was unbearable, like a million tiny insects burrowing deeper into his flesh. He scratched at his arms, desperate to stop the movement, but all he succeeded in doing was tearing his skin open, revealing black soil caked beneath the surface. His veins bulged, twisting in strange, unnatural patterns beneath his skin. The bruises had spread, forming a perfect grin across his chest, as if someone had stitched it into his body from the inside out. And in the silence of his apartment, he heard the giggle again. Software childlike. It was coming from inside him. Peter knew what he had to do. The tunnels beneath Gacy's house were still there, hidden beneath the ruins. He had to find them. He had to go deeper, down into the earth where the dead whispered and the hungry thing waited. He gathered his tools, a flashlight, a crowbar, a shovel, and headed out into the night. His arms ached with every step, the dirt beneath his skin grinding against his bones. But he didn't care anymore. There was no turning back. As Peter approached the ruins of Gacy's house, the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, alive with the whispers of the buried ones. The earth welcomed him, pulling him closer with every step, and somewhere deep in the darkness beneath the house, something stirred. It had been waiting for him all along. The earth was warm beneath Peter's fingers. It clung to his skin, wet and alive, like it was waiting for him. He knelt at the mouth of the tunnel beneath the ruins of Gacy's house, his flashlight flickering as if the air itself rejected light. Every breath was thick with rot and soil, as though the ground had opened up to swallow the living. He shouldn't have come here, but it was too late for regret. His veins throbbed with an unbearable pressure, his muscles spasming involuntarily. The skin along his arms itched and writhed, as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. He scratched until his nails bled, but the sensation only grew worse, spreading through his chest, his neck, his face. Every nerve screamed, but a new voice in his mind whispered over the pain. Almost there, just a little further. The tunnel walls were carved with clown faces, crude smiles chiseled into the stone, their hollow eyes watching Peter's descent. As he crawled deeper into the earth, he saw something moving ahead, just beyond the reach of his flickering flashlight. A shape, twitching, its limbs jerking unnaturally like a marionette held by invisible strings. Peter knew what it was before it even came into focus. It was Darren, or what was left of him. His skin hung in loose, pale sheets, sloughing off in patches, revealing blackened muscle beneath. His eyes were gone, sunken into the sockets, and his mouth had been torn into a jagged smile, stitched at the edges with thick, black thread. Darren's hands trembled violently, his limbs jerking as if controlled by something not entirely human. "You shouldn't have come," Darren rasped, the words slurred and wet, as though they'd been spoken through a mouth full of mud. He doesn't let go. Peter wanted to run, wanted to climb back out of the tunnel and flee into the night. But the tunnel seemed to stretch, the exit shrinking behind him, as if the earth had closed its mouth. There was no way out now. Darren took a shuddering breath. His stitched smile stretched further, tearing the corners of his mouth. Blood dripped down his chin, thick and black like oil. "He's inside you already," Darren whispered. "You feel it, don't you? The itch in your bones, the smile under your skin." Peter's hands trembled. He could feel it. The corners of his mouth twitched uncontrollably, his muscles pulling into a grin that wasn't his own. No matter how hard he tried to stop it, his lips curled upward, stretching wide, wider than they ever should. It hurt. His skin cracked, splitting at the edges, but the grin wouldn't stop. "You can't fight him," Darren said, laughing softly, weakly. "We're all just parts of the same joke, and the punchline is already written." With a sharp convulsion, Darren collapsed into the dirt, his body folding awkwardly, like a broken doll tossed aside. Peter stared at him, breathing hard, the grin still bar stuck to his face. And somewhere deep in the tunnel, he heard the laughter again, soft at first, then louder, echoing through the walls. It wasn't just in the tunnel, it was in him. Peter stumbled further into the dark, his flashlight flickering until it died completely. But he didn't need it anymore. He could see now, perfectly, even in the pitch black. His eyes adjusted to the dark like a predator's, every shadow sharp, every corner clear. The walls of the tunnel closed in tighter, the dirt pressing against him, the ground sucking at his boots as he pushed forward. But it wasn't just the earth around him that felt alive. His own body was changing. His muscles stretched and twisted, his bones cracking painfully as if they were being reshaped from the inside out. His hands swelled and contorted, his fingers curling inward until they resembled claws. He tried to scream, but the sound that escaped wasn't his own voice. It was a high-pitched giggle, jagged and sharp, like nails scraping against glass. Peter's face burned as if fire was ripping through his skin. He clawed at his cheeks, feeling the flesh beneath stretch and sag. His lips, now splitting open, peeled back into a grotesque grin, his jaw dislocating with a sickening pop. His tongue slithered against his teeth, which had begun to sharpen into points, yellow and cracked. The clown inside him, Pogo, was taking shape, and the worst part, it felt right. Peter's heart slowed, the last traces of his resistance slipping away like sand through his fingers. His hands brushed against the clown's suit. Waiting for him in the dirt, a tattered, filthy costume stitched from patches of human skin. It was damp, warm to the touch, and when he lifted it, the suit pulsed beneath his hands. Alive. He knew without being told that this was the final step. If he put on the suit, there would be no turning back. Pogo would take over completely, and Peter Willis would cease to exist. For a moment, just a moment, he thought about resisting, about pulling himself out of the tunnel, clawing his way back to the surface and trying to live some kind of normal life. But then the whisper returned, soft and seductive. "Why fight it, Peter? Smiling feels so much better." Peter slipped the suit over his trembling body. The fabric clung to his skin like a second layer, merging with his flesh, fusing to him. He felt the seams tighten, stitching into his muscles, binding him to the thing inside him. His spine twisted unnaturally, his limbs jerking into place as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. The painted grin stretched across his face, permanent now. The skin sewn so tight it felt like it would split his skull in half. His eyes burned, bright and glassy, reflecting the face of Pogo, the clown. His face etched with madness, and in that moment, Peter understood. He wasn't just possessed by Pogo. He was Pogo. The thing that had lived inside John Wayne Gacy hadn't died. It had simply waited for someone foolish enough to dig too deep, to pull at the threads of a nightmare that should have been left buried. Now it had found a new host, a new body, a new face. Peter. No. Pogo. Staggered out of the tunnel, the night air thick with possibility. His joints ached, his bones felt brittle, but the grin never faltered. Laughter bubbled up from his chest, wild, uncontrollable, spilling from his lips in jagged bursts. It felt so good to laugh. And somewhere, just beyond the town limits, he heard the faint sound of children playing. He began to walk toward them, his oversized shoes slapping against the dirt, his painted grin shining in the moonlight. He was hungry. And soon the world would know the punchline to Gacy's final joke, the joke that never ends. A week later, they found Peter's abandoned apartment, the door still locked from the inside. There was no sign of Peter himself, only a single object left sitting in the middle of the room. A VHS tape, labeled in messy handwriting, Pogo's Secrets. When the police played it, all they heard was laughter. High-pitched, shrill, endless laughter.